Three, two, one, and we are rocking and rolling. Welcome back to the Seb Whitehouse Show. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by James Clark, who is a professor of medieval history at the University of Exeter and the author of this quite incredible piece of work, The Dissolution of the Monasteries, which was released in hardback earlier this month and which we'll definitely be talking about shortly. James Clark, welcome. It is an absolute pleasure to be talking to you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Brilliant. So let's cut straight to the chase. James, you're an expert in medieval history and have dedicated your life to studying it. What is it about this period of time which demands your attention and inspires you to continue learning and writing about it?
It's very simple. I am compelled to pursue it because we know so little. As a student of history, I was almost put off by the sheer scale and scope of the evidence that we have for more recent periods of time, and drawn ever more towards the remote past because of that basic challenge that it presents to us, that so little survives, so little that is tangible, and so few written sources that are reliable, that you face this immense investigative challenge to reach out and recover something of it. So it's almost the separation that we have from the remote past that to me is a great magnet. It draws me on. It's the search into the unknown, quite simply.
Yeah, see, I find that absolutely fascinating because what you're literally saying is there's too much information available in recent history. So it's almost like the detective work is what appeals to you.
Yes, absolutely. I did find off-putting, quite simply, the cacophony of chatter about the recent past. As most school students, I studied the interwar period in the 20th century, the rise of the dictators. And you're bombarded with information and opinion, and this is a period of history that we not only can read about, but we can see, we can visualize with recorded footage, and it almost is the case that it's saturated as an account of what happened. And I really wanted to enter a period of time where almost for some questions, for some topics, you have to begin again from scratch. That there is nothing immediately available to you, and you are doing what I think, perhaps romantically believed, the good historian should do, which is to roll up your sleeves and dig into whatever archives there may be, and sometimes to get hold of any material remains that there are and try to make sense of it, directly responding with the evidence, rather than having to sort of pick over what other people have done before. And at times it feels as if in more recent history that you're left with a kind of journalistic task of just trying to reconcile different arguments between others who've already had their say. And I didn't feel, starting out as a historian, I didn't feel that I just wanted to join a long queue of other people who were having their say on something that had already been argued about a great deal. And one of the, I think, misconceptions about medieval history is in fact there is still a great deal that we simply don't know. That it's not one of those periods of time where everything that can be known is already known. On the contrary, if anything, that characterization could be made of modern history. What new information is there to find out about the dictators of the 1930s? Actually, for our medieval past, there's still vast amounts that we don't know very much about, and that can be investigated. And I just found that hugely exciting.
So for you personally, on a on a personal, intellectual, professional level, is delving into territory and being maybe the first person to uncover certain truths, to form certain narratives, to link certain events, is that something that appeals to you personally, to tread new ground, if you will?
Yes, absolutely. And I do like the literal archaeological aspect of it. That again, many people perhaps would be surprised to discover that there are a great many documents and manuscript books from medieval times that really haven't been looked at closely for hundreds of years. And the number of people who have the knowledge of languages and of ancient scripts to be able to read them is diminishingly small. And so acquiring those skills means that you join a very small group of people who can actually turn over the document or turn over the page and read something that perhaps hasn't been read really by very many people since the moment it was written, since the ink was dry. And that sense of discovery is a great sort of bug, really, that once you get, you find it difficult to shake off. I guess, like anyone of my generation, you know, growing up in the 80s watching Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones, that sense of going off with your specialist knowledge to read something which has been really kept literally in the dark for several hundred years is just immensely exciting and immensely rewarding when you have the chance to do it.
Yeah, I think I've only just began developing a passion for history again in the last month or so. I enjoyed it when I was back at school. I always fared relatively well in my history essays, but that was as far as it went. My interest has definitely faded in the last 15 years or so, but a little flame has been reignited in me again recently. And I think the thing that's grabbing my attention at the moment and making me want to increase my knowledge is actually that feeling of connection and closeness with our ancestors, without whom we would not be here today, without whom we would not be the same people that we are today. It's like our lives and experiences are quite greatly shaped by everyone that came before us. We're, you know, to use that old saying, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. And for me, ruminating on the past, I think it makes me feel more humble and more almost grateful and connected in a way for like who I am and where I am today. Do you personally find the research of history to be a humbling endeavor?
Yes, I can understand that view. I think it's a great kind of leveler that you it helps to almost in a sense to keep you in your own place, to understand that there are lives over many generations, many hundreds of years that have faced so often in the remote past far greater challenges, so many more contingencies, so many more major discontinuities, that it passes to you a really valuable sense of perspective, I think. I think, you know, we perhaps never more so in our generation, we there's a danger of inhabiting a kind of bubble where we feel as if our struggles and trials are uniquely significant. And I think that we can have a much more sort of leveling experience if we keep in view the passage of thousands of years, and to understand a world, to enter a world as I do as a historian of medieval Britain, and understand a world where men and women typically might live no later than into their early 40s, where women's years of fertility were far more far narrower than they are today, when opportunities are confined in a way, even though they are in many respects still today far more confined. I think it is important to have that sense of perspective. And at a time when there's a discourse around almost sort of us being a generation living in great peril, I do think it's important to understand that that's not the unique property of our generation, and that there have been many such perilous moments in the past. I also think that for me, it's important, and again, one of the pulls of the medieval past is that it makes us confront a society very, very different from our own, with very different values. And again, I think in our own generation, sometimes there's a danger that we only want to confront things which in some way reinforce our own position, our own perspective, our own values. And I do think it's incredibly healthy, intellectually, culturally, socially, to get to know difference as well as sameness. And there's so much about our medieval past in Britain, its social hierarchy, its practice of almost universal practice of religion, which is in many ways alien to our own generation. And I think it's an incredibly constructive experience to immerse yourself in that, where there are very few points of contact. Yes, we have a kind of common humanity with these people in the medieval past, but more or less everything else about their world is entirely different to our own. And I think that's good for us, because I think we should be a little worried about almost wanting to live in a kind of homogenized present where we only look out on things which just sort of are the mirror image of our own little world. And I think particularly when we look globally, I think the more we can learn to understand systems of value that are totally alien and totally, in some ways, totally counter to our own, that can only be a good thing. It equips us to live in our own day to some extent.
What do you think about the recent tendency to judge historical figures by the values of today? Do you think that there's a danger in doing that? Do you think doing that misses the point, or do you think it's an inescapable part of having values?
In a sense, I suppose I'd want to answer yes to both propositions, in that at a basic level, I think it's incredibly healthy for any received account or any received argument about any past to be up for grabs, to be open to challenge. Because history isn't as I understand it, it's not a definitive account of the past, which once written is put on a shelf and dusted down, but never changed. It is just a kind of discourse, and like any discourse, it should be tested, challenged, rewritten, and it's part of what has kept this way of speaking and narrating and writing about the past alive since ancient times, is that every generation has come along and said, there is much about this account of the past that we've inherited that we don't like, and we want to reinvent it, reimagine it. So at a basic level, it's a positively healthy thing. And for anyone to suggest that any account of the past is somehow untouchable is hugely problematic. And actually, no not doing any favors to the subject, the discipline of history. Historians, any historian who doesn't embrace that at a basic level is, to my mind, is essentially not doing a good service to their profession. But at the same time, I think there is an inherent danger in any tendency to look on a past era and somehow to make it be reconciled to values which belong to another age. We need to be aware of distortion, of anachronism, and of somehow describing a past purely in the light of our own present. Because what we end up with there is then an account which actually is more or less detached from the period that we're trying to describe itself. But nobody can be objective. So really any historian is of course writing in the light of their own values. So I think some of the more, shall I say, traditional voices that have been very vocal in recent times in expressing sometimes real anger about the way that some received accounts of history are being challenged. They, to be honest, have a misplaced belief that somehow these old accounts were sort of value free or in some way objective. No, they weren't, of course. The great Victorian historians passed down to us a view of Britain's past which was indelibly marked by their own values, and every generation has done that. What we must just be wary of is that in doing that, we are simply continuing that process. We're not somehow setting up a now unimpeachable, entirely objective account of the past. We may well be correcting and rebalancing gross distortions that the previous generations were guilty of, and that can only be a good thing. But we mustn't overclaim what we are capable of doing. We're not capable of somehow achieving some standard of objectivity that is far greater than any previous generation. We are just as much bound to our own present time and our own set of subjective concerns as any previous generation. But there is no doubt that there is a job of certainly rebalancing, sometimes correcting, to be done on certain topics. And at the most obvious level, so many key actors in our past and so many whole constituencies of society in earlier generations were simply left out of the historical account. And it's hugely important that now we correct that, quite simply. And at times it is simply a matter of correcting those accounts which have left out whole parts of our shared social experience cannot be allowed to stand. As long as we understand that what we produce to replace them will still be marked by our own preoccupations in the early 21st century.
Right, because I think, I think that final point's important, because there's we haven't specified exactly what we're talking about here, but in relation to British history, there's obviously been a lot of talk recently about altering the curriculum in schools, and to make sure that history, the history that's taught in school is not just history that's told by the winners, you know. And I think you were kind of touching on that just then. And as you said, sometimes the history of this country is written out as one positive event after the other, and as you say, some things were left out. But I suppose, You just have to be cautious and make sure that it's not an overcorrection, and it's not, there's not two political viewpoints battling out for their version of history, the version of history that they prefer.
Yeah, no, of course that's right. I do think that it at the level of a school curriculum, it can be quite simply addressed, in that too often in the past, a history syllabus has simply been teaching the actions of governments over time, and an obvious and simple way of addressing that is of course to present to students a past which is about more than the actions of government. What about exploring the effects of those actions of government on different constituencies of society? That in itself would be a simple but really significant way of rebalancing. And of course, it was simply a legacy of a largely Victorian idea of what history should be learned in mass education. That it was a story of the sort of glorious march of representative government, which is at best a very narrow perspective on our past, and absolutely needs to be approached differently.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of history in this country, and I'm sure all around the world, was more about documenting events, kind of quite formal, limited amount of information about like formal, limited documentation of events, but without going into any real detail, or often without explaining why or how these events came about. I was interviewing Annie Whitehead the other day about her book about the ancient kingdom of Mercia, and the amount of information that's available is just so limited. The writing that was being done was mainly by monks, and they were keeping a record rather than going into any sort of detail. So almost like the polar opposite of what you disliked about Victorian history.
Yes, absolutely. And I think for a long time, certainly for most of the 20th century, the view was that what needs to be taught in schools is a kind of chronological outline, a chronological framework, so that the next generation somehow can position themselves in this sequence of events. I do think over the last 25 years or so, there's no doubt that school history has changed a good deal from that. But there's still a tendency in the way that certain periods tend to be privileged above others, and the way that certainly in the teaching of British history in school, students tend to be marched from the Norman conquest to the Tudors to the Victorians to the 20th century world wars, and what at best they might carry from that is only an understanding of a very limited sequence of moments or eras, which isn't really the sort of real texture of a historical understanding that you'd hope that they would take from it. And what it does tend to reinforce is that past experience is all about rulers and the experience of being governed, which of course is, as I say, a very, very narrow way of understanding historical experience, and ideally we would move away from that much more fully towards an understanding of different experiences in different constituencies in society.
Yeah, I think most people would probably be more interested in hearing about the lives of normal people in 500, 750, 1000 AD, 1500. I think most people would be more interested in hearing about the lives of day-to-day people and the different types of people that you had in society, and the diversity of different opinions and thoughts and hobbies and lifestyles. I think that's more appealing. But a lot of history, and this is obviously just due to the scarcity of information, a lot of it is, like, as you say, it's who was governing, who was sitting on the throne, and dates relating to that.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And I think we've also become rather too preoccupied with certain eras. although I've written a book relating to that era myself, I think that in this country we have a strange fascination for the Tudor period, and it is almost the case now, it seems, as if particularly for many people whose study of history ends with their school days, we've arrived at a situation where most people have a general understanding of the history of the past 100 years or so, or at least of the events of the 20th century. And then all they have beyond that, reaching further back, is some understanding of the Tudors. And it's almost as if the Tudors have become a kind of catch-all, a proxy for all of our remote past. And as a medieval historian, that does concern me. I think it's high time, really, that we moved on from simply thinking that the only past earlier than the Victorians that we need to know about is Henry VIII and his wives. I'm not sure that our endless retelling of those stories is necessarily a good thing.
Well, yeah, despite that is a great segue onto Henry VIII. I mean, I think if you ask the average person on the street about Henry VIII, most would probably point out, as you said, that he had 6 wives and he executed a couple of them, and he famously broke away from the Catholic Church in Rome so he could get a divorce. He's one of the most controversial figures in European history, and maybe that was for the reasons you just said. Maybe he's just simply received more study and attention than many others. But correct me if I'm wrong, I believe there's been about 60 or 70 English monarchs in the last 1,200 years, and most people haven't heard of most of them. But like as you were just saying, everyone has heard of Henry VIII. He's got quite the reputation, hasn't he? Do you think it's deserved, or do you think it links in with what you were just saying, that it might be slightly disproportionate?
Oh, I think it is disproportionate.
Really? Wow.
I think it is because the Tudor period has become a sort of proxy, as I say, for our remote past. I give a lot of talks in schools, and I've had early years children say to me, well, the only monarch, the only period I've heard of, the only bit of history I know about before Queen Victoria is the Tudors. And it's almost as if we have 3 epochs in British history. We have the 20th century, we have the Victorians, and then we have the Tudors. So I think the continual focus on Henry VIII is a product in part of that. So in other words, it's a product of the way that we've sort of forgotten about all that surrounds it, and certainly the way that the medieval period has been steadily sidelined in the way that we think and write and represent our history. It's just not been presented to general audiences in the way that the Tudor period has. I don't think he's a controversial figure at all, because it does seem to me that the same observations about Henry are made all the time. He's fat, he's much married, he's a bit of a tyrant. He's in many ways, he's quite a weirdly kind of unifying figure in national culture, because his attributes seem to be something that we can all agree on. And I think in many ways the success of presentations of him in popular novels and in historical novels and in popular biographies and on screen is because of that general agreement that he is this figure who is personally not an attractive figure. He's something of a pantomime villain, and what's so frustrating as a historian is that those characteristics are rarely challenged. And one of the things that I must admit frustrates me a bit about the treatment of him in Hilary Mantel's trilogy is that these long-standing characteristics haven't really been challenged yet again. What we get in Mantel is Henry the tyrannical husband and lover, pursuing his own personal gratification throughout the 1520s and 30s, and really in many ways leaving the business of government to his henchmen, and above all to Thomas Cromwell. Mantel has the huge advantage of an enormous audience to address, and yet what she's offered that audience is in effect what they already know, which is this view of Henry as a kind of villainous character, rather than to take that opportunity, having grabbed their attention with a very well-written, well-realized, authentic Tudor past. And she's not really taking the opportunity to say, well, this is the Henry that you perhaps were expecting, so let me show you another, an alternative Henry. And I think that's a great shame.
Right. Well, it seems like, it does seem like he was a very complex man. And when I was reading about him, I stumbled across a quote by David Starkey, which presents perhaps the softer side to Henry VIII, which he's less well known for. And he said, what is extraordinary is that Henry was usually a very good husband, and he liked women. That's why he married so many of them. Okay. He was very tender to them. We know that he addressed them as sweetheart. He was a good lover. He was very generous. The wives were given huge settlements of land and jewels. They were loaded with jewels. He was immensely considerate when they were pregnant. But once he had fallen out of love, he just cut them off. He just withdrew. He abandoned them. They didn't even know he'd left them. And my research, especially into the earlier life of Henry, that he was actually very intelligent and charismatic and well-liked. And I'm really interested to know, are you saying that you think the popular depiction of him is a bit of a caricature? If so, to what extent? And what were some of his qualities you think that are less well-known?
Yes, there's no doubt that it's a caricature. And like any good caricature drawing, certain facets of his figure and personality have just been exaggerated to the point of distortion. He grows very fat towards the end of his life, but that doesn't mean that he looks like that throughout his reign. He becomes increasingly paranoid, but I think that paranoia, which is manifest again in his later years, has been sort of back projected earlier into his life in a way that actually isn't supported by the evidence. I think there are so many aspects of him that we've allowed to be hidden away. His relationship with his father, I think, is one of the keys to understanding the real Henry. And his father is not well known to a general audience. Henry VII is a fascinating monarch. He's also in many respects a sort of ultimate medieval monarch. He does many of the things that we associate with medieval monarchs. And Henry VIII, in so many respects, for much of his reign, is actually trying to follow the path taken by his father. So Henry is immensely interested in investing in the old traditional medieval church, just like his father Henry VII was. Henry is mostly interested in scoring international success on a European battlefield, just like the earlier medieval monarchs that he looks up to, great figures like Henry V, the victor of Agincourt. And again, he draws that really from his father and his father's generation. So I think we have to understand or bring back into the spotlight Henry, the medieval monarch, Henry, his father's son, You've mentioned Henry's intellect. Again, that in the determination to tell us again about what a tyrannical personality is and how badly he treats women. Again, that tends to get lost. But he is a man with a fine brain, and with for any well-born man of sort of noble stock, he's got a high level of learning and language skill, and a good indication of that actually is the evidence of his relationships with some of the most learned men in the kingdom. And one of the reasons, in fact, that some of the older figures in the monastic communities actually like Henry very much is because they do feel that although he's a much younger man and he's the monarch, that he understands them and has an appreciation of the life of dedicated learning that they lead. And Henry, in turn, looks to those learned men who might be seen as part of the old regime that Henry wants to do away with. Actually, he relies on them even during the time that he's making the case for his divorce from Catherine of Aragon. He's consulting these sort of old wise greybeards who, according to the popular legend, are precisely the kind of people that Henry wants to sweep away. But no, not at all. He's sensitive to these things. What we see, I think, in Henry is a man who actually venerates tradition. He's actually quite attached to tradition. One of the points I make in my book is that even after some monasteries have been shut down, Henry actually sets up new ones. Now, that is the act of a man who really does love tradition and can't quite let it go. And again, I think that's the long shadow kind of cast over him by his father, because his father is very, very interested in doing exactly what traditional medieval monarchs do, which is to draw on the sort of symbolic and ceremonial power you get from the church to make their monarchy seem even greater and grander. And Henry buys into that, just like any previous medieval monarch. And one reason, of course, that Thomas Cromwell is finally falling foul of Henry VIII in 1540 is because of this traditionalism within Henry, which sort of wells up inside him. And it does in waves, I think, through his reign. So he's a man. We so often, and historians are guilty of this as much as anyone else, we so often associate him with great changes in Britain. But actually, I think we've got to remember Henry the traditionalist, Henry the medieval monarch, and actually Henry the man who, in so many respects, is actually quite backward looking. He's not, in so many ways, he's not the great Renaissance man. There are plenty of extraordinary Renaissance men around him, but he himself, I think if Henry had a dream, he had a dream of being a king like Henry V. He would love to have one knockout victory on the French battlefield. He would love to be the toast of the great and the good of Europe, like any king of medieval England wanted to be. And he would like to have a very closely bound relationship with the traditional institutions of medieval society, including the church. His first thought towards the church is not somehow to tear it down, but to just bind it really closely to his regime, which is exactly what monarchs, frankly, in England from William the Conqueror forward wanted to do.
Do you think that Henry VIII may have suffered from a little bit of internal friction between wanting to honour that tradition, wanting to honour his father, but also perhaps his own natural personality disposition was one that was slightly more reckless and slightly more unpredictable and emotional. Do you think that that was part of his internal makeup, trying to counterbalance those two forces to an extent?
Absolutely, yes. No, I think that's the case. I think that if what I've described is what amounts to an agenda for Henry VIII, where he struggles to realize that is in part down to a very capricious and changeable personality. It does seem it's so changeable, it's almost seasonal. You almost get a sort of a summer Henry and a winter Henry. And I think it's no surprise, for example, that he wants to remember the dead Jane Seymour with a new foundation of a monastery, a very traditional act that a medieval monarch might have undertaken in the summer months. You know, and the winter Henry is so often the one that is more prone to accepting and believing the whispers of conspiracy that might be passed to him. And that, yeah, there is no doubt that there is a kind of bipolarity that is present. I mean, I think it's worth saying that, of course, this isn't unique, and it's not that he is a uniquely changeable and unpredictable character surrounded by people who are much steadier in some way. I think also it's worth remembering that he, like any monarch in any period, is subject to fast-moving circumstances around him. And the European scene, which is so often left out of our accounts, there's something very narrow and old-fashioned about the way we still present Henry VIII, because we seem to want to suggest that going on in this is only going on between sort of Westminster and Hampton Court, but Henry is a European monarch, and like any European monarch in the early 16th century, he's subject to a fast-moving and pretty challenging international scene. And the English monarchy doesn't hold in any way the balance of power. Other greater powers in Europe are, to a great extent, determining Henry's next move. And we need to paint that surrounding set of circumstances, I think, back in to the situation. The other key factor, which has got nothing to do with personality, and is something that pretty much every English monarch had struggled with, is money, and Henry is constantly struggling to match that agenda that he has with the resources available to pursue it, and those resources are limited, and just holding the Tudor regime in place itself exhausts quite a lot of his resources.
Yeah. Is it correct in saying that Henry VII was much more of a sort of cautious king, much more shrewd with money, a reputation for being slightly more reserved but determined, but in a more passive sort of way? Because I think the picture that's painted, and maybe you can tell me whether or not you agree with this, is that it was kind of a tale as old as time. The dad works hard, saves money, leaves the kid with everything, and then the rich kid blows all the money on through a string of unsuccessful marriages and pomp and splendor. Again, is that a simple caricature, or?
I think there's an element of truth in that Henry VII bequeaths to his son relative financial stability, but he doesn't bequeath to him some great war chest of cash that the new monarch can come along and just waste. What Henry VII achieves shouldn't be therefore exaggerated. He brings things back into a balanced state, but he doesn't really go much further than that. Yes, absolutely, he's shrewd, and famously he signs his own accounts, and he's very conscious of the fact that much of the stability of any royal regime depends on money. But those balanced books that he passes to his son can be quite quickly unbalanced simply by circumstances, and the very delicate international situation becomes ever more challenging for Henry VIII. So even if we left out of the equation, even if Henry didn't have this determination to go and prove himself on a European battlefield, even if he was following a purely defensive strategy, those limited resources would still have been put under great strain pretty early into his reign, because the rivalries between the empire, the very ambitious Kingdom of France, and so on, would have still forced Henry into taking some action. But of course, the fact is that he does have those ambitions, and so he takes books that have been quite narrowly balanced, and he puts them under immense strain. His spending is I would have said that the damaging spending that Henry does is less in pomp and circumstance and great splendid buildings, as in simply trying to fulfill his ambition of being a monarch who can be a major military force in Europe. That's what costs all of the money. His effort to challenge Scotland with his military might, and at the same time the main European powers, is a constant and pretty fatal drain on his resources, because it's not just about putting men and armaments into the field, but it carries with it something which we still see in southwest England today, which is a whole chain of fortifications around the country, and they cost significant sums of money too. That he's putting his kingdom onto a war footing, and as we know from pretty much any period of history, it's always that is a make or break for the financial solvency of a regime, and for Henry it breaks it.
Sure. I'm very interested to know the extent to which his specific reputation for being a tyrant compares to the reality of the reign of other kings. Of course, we know that Henry VIII is notorious for being a tyrant. Do we have information available to us that, compared to other kings, he was not as tyrannical as his reputation suggests? Because I read somewhere that he executed, I think it was like 57,000 people in 36 years, which is quite a lot. I'm surprised that he had time to do anything else, to be perfectly honest. But I wondered, do we have records of other lesser known kings who were, equally as tyrannical as Henry, but just we haven't heard of them, or at least the average person hasn't heard of them and doesn't speak about them very often?
Well, I do think, yes, we don't have to reach very far back into medieval history before Henry VIII to find really very comparable situations where favourite advisors or counsellors have risen very far and very fast, only to fall catastrophically and to die either directly at the hands of the monarch or some other faction to come along and to remove them. And throughout the 14th century in England under the reign of Edward II, and then in the last years of Edward III, and in the reign of his grandson Richard II, we see similar situations, and then again under King Henry IV at the beginning of the 15th century. The spectacle of churchmen being executed under Henry VIII. Again, this isn't unique. The Archbishop of York had been executed under King Henry IV, having fallen foul of him, and it was widely believed that king was cursed as a result of allowing the execution of a venerated archbishop. So yes, I think you're quite right. The fact that so many of these other surrounding eras of England's medieval history are just not very well known has somehow suggested that there's something very different about Henry's reign. I think the distinctive feature of the violence of Henry's reign is how concentrated it is. That what we're seeing here is a violent period over a really very short span of years. That the most intense period is really between when he makes himself head of the church in 1534, really to the end of his reign. So we've got a little more than a dozen years of intense crises where councillors, favourites, churchmen, opponents fall at his hands. We can find points of comparison in many other reigns, but not in such a concentrated period of time. And it's difficult not to say that therefore this must be a period of exceptional instability. It's a very febrile moment, and I think that what Henry does create in his regime, which other monarchs don't to the same degree, is a kind of climate of fear. And you do see that when you work through the surviving documents, particularly the personal letters that survive, whether it's from courtiers, members of Henry's own, officers of Henry's own government, and churchmen. The one thing that their correspondence all has in common is it's clear that they are acutely anxious through these years, that there is a real sense of fear and uncertainty, and of that sort of instinctive watching your back, not quite knowing who to trust, not quite knowing what the consequences of any of your actions are. And I've been struck by how that runs really very, very high up into government, that there are key officers of government who are clearly very worried almost one day to the next. You know, are the things that I do today in my role going to somehow come back at me? And I think there, you know, it is a little comparable to some regimes that we know about from much more recent times. You know, in that wonderful Amanda Iannucci film, The Death of Stalin, where the members of the Politburo are you can almost feel the static electricity between them because they're all so tense. And I think Henry's court and government in the 1530s is not unlike that. These are people who are on edge, walking on eggshells much of the time.
I wonder if that culture of fear which you speak of partly contributes to the reputation that he has now, as if almost the historical record began then and his reputation continued through the centuries as a result of the atmosphere you just described.
Yes, I think that's true. Like so many figures in history, we tend to act as sort of final judge and jury. So we begin our portrait of Henry VIII with our knowledge of what happens at the end, or what has happened by the end, and so we it's almost as if we're there with the ledger of those whose fall and death he caused, and we build up from that. And of course, retrospection like that is no friend to good history. The one thing that those who lived through this period of time didn't have was that foreknowledge of how these things would fall out in the passage of time. And we must be wary as historians not to do this, not to take advantage of the position that we're at in knowing those things. So we need to understand the Henry that his subjects knew. And that, of course, helps to explain. I mean, I'm often asked by students, given what we know about Henry VIII, why is it that churchmen and nobility and councillors and so on cooperated with him? Why is it that they didn't recoil in horror? But of course, they didn't know. They didn't know what the outcome of some of these agendas are. And what they did know was the Henry that we sometimes struggle to see, which is the man who is cultured, erudite, has a gift for friendship. I think David Stark is quite right about that he does have a warmth which people who encounter him speak about that. And it's that explains how this is a regime that doesn't just sort of fall apart or just blow apart, but actually holds together. That certainly it's a forceful personality, but forces which attract as well as repel.
Sure. That's what I find very fascinating about him. And it's what I found very fascinating looking into him, the lesser known aspects of his personality. And yeah, it would just be fascinating to know who he was inside his own head and how that changed over the years, and what his thought processes were. I mean, people change as they get older, but quite often people tend to mellow as they get older. People tend to often have the more tyrannical, impulsive side of their personalities dominate when they're young. With Henry, it seemed to go the opposite way. Do you think that's correct, or is that another simplification?
I think no. I think there's no doubt that the more febrile, uncertain, paranoid, and even vindictive Henry emerges over time, I don't think there is a mellowing, but I'm not sure that that's so surprising. I think it's quite common in people who are growing older and perhaps growing more and more infirm and uncertain of their own physical resilience and power, to become more suspicious, to become less trusting, to become even paranoid at worst. I think as the prowess and independence that you knew in your youth becomes ever more challenged, actually, you can become ever more fearful. And so I think, if anything, we just need to remind ourselves that these are quite recognizable human traits, in fact, that we can recognize in ourselves and in our own day. I think that actually our surprise at that says more about the way that we tend to sort of have a rather romantic view of a medieval or a 16th century monarch, that we somehow feel that maybe they should sort of grow into the role and become this great august figure. But well, no, they are They are human like anyone else. And I think we do have to remember that Henry, in the last 8 or 9 years of his life, is subject to intermittent bouts of poor health. He, by all accounts, did have immense physical prowess and strength as a young man. He's lost all of that by the late 1530s. He finds it difficult to move. I think we should also remember that he's seen a good many of the friends, really, really close friends of his youth, actually die off. Often, even in the context of the time, often too young, before their time. And he's lost friends even before the divorce from Catherine in the late 1520s. Of course, Jane Seymour, the love of his life, he's lost as well. And we know, again, it's a recognizable human trait that if you've suffered loss, if you've known how contingent life is, and that falling victim to disease, it could be just around the corner, then again it can make for edgier behavior. So I think we've got to remind ourselves that many of the tendencies and behaviors that we see are not actually extraordinary, but they're actually rather recognizable.
Yeah, that's very interesting. They're recognizable, but they're much more extreme considering the role that he had and the era in which he lived. He was undergoing a normal human experience, a perfectly understandable evolution of character, and yet due to the position he was in and due to the era that he lived in, we look back at it now and think that perhaps he was particularly paranoid, particularly tyrannical, particularly murderous.
Yes, I think we do have to remember, again, because we tended to detach the Tudors from a wider narrative of our past. I think we often forget that the Tudor regime was still very new when Henry comes to the throne in 1509, and I think it's, to a general audience, it's generally overlooked that what had marked Henry VII's reign, his father's reign more than anything, was constant rebellion. And the threat to that regime is almost ever present. And Henry, I think, is acutely aware of that. This is a dynasty whose roots do not run very deep, and whose popularity with those who have the power in them to overthrow them is also not very deep. That at best the Tudor hold on the throne is tolerated. It's not that they've become the widely popular monarchs of people's hearts that we might associate with Elizabeth I almost half a century later. These early Tudor monarchs, Henry VII and Henry VIII, are quite different to that. They're not taken into the hearts of the political nation. And again, it's hardly surprising that for much of his reign, Henry is acutely conscious of that. And so he does use great severity against those he perceives to be enemies. But I think that is in the context of somebody who, as a child and then as a young man, knew that he and his family were holding on to power only very tenuously.
That's interesting.
And at any point that could come to an end. And we have to imagine, we don't know a great deal about Henry's upbringing, but we have to assume that within the royal household, that was the dominant sort of spectre at the feast, the spectre that this family that had swept into power could be swept out again just as quickly.
How were people executed in, we can talk medieval times generally, or Henry VIII specifically? What were the different forms of execution, and were more brutal deaths reserved for different people who committed different crimes?
Yeah, so those who are condemned, who are closest to the regime, like Cromwell, and of course Anne Boleyn, are executed by beheading. Those who are outside of that immediate circle, who are condemned as traitors, some of them, not all of them, but some of them are subject to the most gruesome execution of being hanged and then taken down and eviscerated whilst they're still conscious.
What exactly does that mean?
Quartered.
What exactly would happen in that?
Well, it means that they hang them until they're semi-conscious, so they don't break the neck. So they semi-suffocate them. Generally, as I understand it, with hanging, it's perfectly possible to, unless you pull on somebody's feet, it's perfectly possible for them to be partially asphyxiated, but not to have their neck broken. So they would then cut them down, and then they would begin disemboweling them.
Wow.
And within a matter of anything between seconds and a few minutes, the catastrophic loss of blood would kill them. But for some, it's clear that they would be conscious enough to suffer the terrible pain of being cut open, and then they are quartered. Then during the 1530s, those who are executed for heresy, that is, despite the changes Henry is making to the church, those who are seen to be supporters of radical Protestantism are executed by burning. And eyewitness accounts suggest that this is just as terrible a fate as execution by drawing and quartering, because, again, the amount of time that the victim would remain conscious during the process, because they build a wall of firewood around them, and it has a kind of funneling effect. So they are trapped in a kind of cylinder of smoke and fumes. So they will be coughing desperately and struggling to breathe, and suffering from the intense heat. But the way that the pyre is constructed means that it can take a very long time for them actually to catch a light. So it would be like, I suppose, being trapped in a house fire where you're shut inside a room. So the effects of smoke and, again, asphyxiation and intense heat will be suffered before the actual fate of catching fire. So I mean, it's all pretty gruesome, though in a sense, I suppose, the fortunate ones who are the ones who are executed by the headsman's axe, because it's a generally a relatively short process, although famously there are many accounts of it taking more than one cut to actually do the job.
Yeah, they were brutal times. There was certainly seems to be less respect for human life back then. Is it true that that sort of medieval cliche that everyone would come and watch?
Um, not quite in that those who are executed at the Tower of London, these are, if you like, executions that are contained within the political regime, and so there isn't a sort of mass gathering around the scaffold. So Anne Boleyn is executed in that context. It's not a public execution, but certainly some of the burnings of heretics are carried out at Tyburn, where it is in a public context, and yes, people do gather to see, and of course that's part of what the regime is trying to do. Actually, an execution that is kept within the regime doesn't serve nearly as useful a purpose as
Sure.
something that becomes a whole piece of theatre. Given my interest in the dissolution, the execution of the Abbot of Glastonbury, Glastonbury in Somerset, is one of the most spectacular as a piece of public theatre, because it channels all kinds of symbolism. So he's taken from the abbey at Glastonbury, which is right in the heart of what would have been the medieval town at Glastonbury, and he's tied to a hurdle, so a piece of fence panel, if you like, and he's taken to be executed with two other monks who are accused specifically, not accused of being traitors, but are accused of theft. And he's taken to Glastonbury Tor, which is the extraordinary tall hill outside the town of Glastonbury. And he and the two others are executed on the top of the Tor. Now, to the Tudor audience, there's a huge amount of very, very resonant symbolism to that execution, because these are medieval Christians. They are steeped in Christian teaching. So, of course, the story of a holy man being taken outside of a town to a hill to die immediately seems very recognizable, and is an extraordinary act, I think, on the part of Thomas Cromwell, because there is a direct sort of referencing of another holy man's death that is at the heart of the Christian story. I think it tells us, reminds us that execution is not just about brutality. I think to 21st century audiences, we think most about the savagery and the crudity of these deaths. But I think if we want to understand these regimes, I think we do need to understand also the use of symbolism, the theatrics of it, that they were as interested in the whole performance, if you like, the message they wanted to plant, I think, in the minds of Henry's subjects was not so much about the brutality of the regime, but more about the fact that the regime really had complete command of the symbolism, of the ceremonial, and of the narrative, that they could do something as almost outrageous as somehow channeling the Christian story itself to teach this old abbot a lesson in some way, and it's a sign, I think, of the depth of thought that is in Henry VIII's regime. I think we do them a disservice in a way if we see them as simply brutal tyrants,
sure.
because because there's actually rather more subtlety to them than that. There's more kind of nuance in the way that they use symbols and visual messages.
That's fascinating. You mentioned at the start of that story your interest in the dissolution, which I think could be a perfect time to start talking about it. Your book, The Dissolution of the Monasteries. What exactly was the dissolution of the monasteries? How much of a big deal was this at the time? And what inspired you to write the book about it?
Okay. It quite simply is the biggest drama of Henry VIII's reign. And that might seem a surprising thing to say because we think of the executions we've just been talking about, we think of the wives, and so on. I think we've actually forgotten collectively that it is quite simply the biggest drama of the Reformation. It's the one thing in Henry VIII's reign that really is the most immediate dramatic change. There are almost 850 monasteries in England and Wales at the beginning of Henry VIII's reign. And in just about 4 years, every one of them is closed. And that's a large number, and they're pretty evenly distributed across the country. So many people, most of the centres of population were surrounded by these institutions. So the removal of these institutions is a dramatic moment. And it is probably the most visible moment of change that Henry VIII's subjects experienced in their lifetime. Many of the other changes that he unleashed were not really visible or tangible to ordinary people for years, even generations. But this was an immediate and profound change to what they saw on their own horizons, if you like, on their own doorstep, because nobody lived more than a few miles away from a monastery or a religious house, whether it contained monks or friars or nuns. These were embedded in provincial society. And it's a big deal because they're not just church institutions. In our own secular world, it's quite difficult to grasp, I think, exactly what a monastery was. They were much more than a place of religious worship, and much more than just a sort of place where religious people, priests or others, lived. They're not just seminaries, which might be our first thought when we think about a monastery. They are, if you like, whole corporations. They're businesses, because their religious activities are funded through their owning of property. And they own property in their immediate environment, but then right across the country as well. And the richest of them owned property across whole swathes of the country. That property is lived in and worked by tenants, by employees. And so shutting them down is comparable to the shutting down of a great business corporation. That it's not just the leadership who are affected, and actually it's not just the buildings that suddenly become empty, but there's a whole chain of others who are affected by that closure. So just like when a business closes today, the employees are affected as well as the management, but then also those with whom they do business, they are affected as well. And monasteries were centers of employment, centers of economic activity. Many other trades and businesses depended on them. So when you close one down, just like when we close a business today, lots of other businesses are affected by that. So you've got to imagine a series of ripples passing through provincial society when you close down every one of those. And if you multiply that by 850, then you've got ripples passing over the whole of the country. And this is carried out in, as I say, just 4 years. You've got a population, total population, we think, of people who actually lived as monks, friars, or nuns, of maybe as many as 10 or 12,000, which in a total population of 2.5 to 3 million in England and Wales at the time might seem a small number. But then if you add in all of the people that they employed, all of the people who were tenants of their property, all of the people and businesses who depended on doing business with them, then you've got a much, much larger number. And it would be difficult to find any part of the community that wasn't in some way touched by this closure. I think it's fair to say that the disruption to ordinary economic and social life it can only be compared to the Norman conquest, when suddenly people are turned out of their property and a new invading force arrives. And in some ways, I think the dissolution touches ordinary people's lives more profoundly than that. So for me, I felt as a historian that this was so evidently the big story of Henry VIII's reign, and it just struck me as very surprising that there hadn't been a book about it for more than 50 years, and it was a story that needed to be told, and one that needed to be told differently. I was very keen to look at it from the point of view of the people who it affected, rather than it to be yet again a story of Henry VIII, Thomas Cromwell, and government policy. I wanted it to be understood again as less a political act and more an experience of wider society, and that's what I've tried to capture, really.
If you were given the task of relaying a modern day equivalent of the dissolution of the monasteries, let's say something were to happen in 2021 tomorrow, one of our world leaders or country leaders were to make a decision with the same magnitude as the dissolution of the monasteries, what do you think would be a relevant modern day comparison to really hammer home just what a big deal this was? Because I'll tell you what mine was when I was explaining it to my family, and you can tell me if you think this is completely wrong, but the closest I could come up with was when Donald Trump was thrown off Twitter. Imagine Trump was thrown off Twitter, and in order to seek his revenge, he closed social media across the entire United States. That was it. Social media is closed. If social media won't let me do what I want and say what I want, then social media is over. Except social media obviously has only been around for about 15 years or so, whereas monasteries have been around for 400 plus years. Would that be a rough comparison to try and hammer home the magnitude of this event?
I think it's quite a nice comparison, because what I like about it is that social media, like monasteries in medieval and Tudor England, is both a source of comfort to people, but also a source of great provocation. It's both angel and devil, isn't it? And monasteries had that Janus-like character to them. Some people love them, some people love to hate them, just like people feel very, very polarized responses to social media. But I think that still, I would dare to say, in certainly in British society, proportionately speaking, it's a relative minority of our population who would actually honestly say they can't live without social media, and that they would worry about where they live, their home, their employment, or their education, their future, if social media suddenly shut down.
Right.
So that's where the comparison breaks down.
Sure.
I think the comparison is something that is much more a long-term part of our landscape that we only know we can't live without when it's gone. And that possibly also we've allowed to take for granted for quite a long time, to the point that it's got a bit neglected. But then we feel the sort of frustration and cost to ourselves when it's gone. I mean, one comparison, it's not exactly contemporary, but one that I have used in the past is, because it's a particularly British story, is actually the shutting down of, what was it, about a third of our railway network in the 1960s. Now, until the mid-1960s, Britain had this extraordinary rail network that could get you to really obscure places in remote parts of the country, but it was neglected, and it was, in many people's eyes, not very modern. It was also not very economic, and it was regarded as a bit eccentric and one of those quirks of Britain. But it became clear probably within 5-10 years, when it was gone, how much, in fact, of life and economic activity in towns and villages, how access to everything from education to recreation was actually depending on it. It's just that nobody in Britain had perhaps realized that, or they'd rather taken it for granted until it was gone. I think the systematic removal of monasteries is a bit like that, it was probably a relatively small number of people who were completely devoted to them by Henry VIII's reign, just like probably it was only a small number of total enthusiasts who thought that Britain's branch line railways were a good thing in the 1960s. But when they're no longer there, and when towns and villages suddenly find that they can't so easily get to London, they realize what they've lost and begin to think, well, maybe I should have valued them more when they were here. I think that's what we have to understand. In terms of their place in the landscape, it's a bit like that railway station that you knew used to be on the edge of town, and it's now just a new modern housing estate, and it's all been built over. But for something that we have in our lives today, I suppose if every out of town supermarket suddenly was removed, and we went back to the situation that we those of us who can remember, the 1970s, early 1980s, where there weren't out of town supermarkets, and people did their shopping on the high street, and you didn't have that immense facility of being able to go to one place to get lots of different things. It's that sort of loss that we have to understand, because I can't emphasize enough, yes, of course, monasteries are about religion, but they're about so many other things as well. There are places where schooling was available. They are places where social welfare of a great many different kinds, from the giving out of charity and food to care for the sick and the very elderly, is provided. Places of employment, places of industry, because they're investing in all sorts of industry by the 16th century. All of that is shut down.
Yeah, so a huge change, and as you say, it's one that more people should be aware of, and it's a more interesting aspect of Henry VIII's reign than perhaps the caricature of his personality that we have been obviously speaking about at points. How long did it actually take you to write this book? Because it's quite phenomenal, the level of detail that you go into in this book, and I'm fascinated to just know how much research you did into it and how long it took you to write it, because It's extraordinary, really. As I say, the detail is extraordinary.
Well, it's true to say I've been working on this a long time. I have been researching the role that monasteries had in people's lives for most of my career. So what I've done is drawn on research data that I've built up over many years, but the complete immersion into the archives really has been the work of about 3 or 4 years.
Wow.
And then I've been writing up over really 2019 and part of 2020, and then having to deal with the impact of lockdowns on research, which by no means the most important challenge of the last 18 months, but a challenge. Sure. Because libraries and archives have been shut, and also I found I'd left illustrating the book until the very end, only to find that the sites that I wanted to photograph, of course, were all closed, and it wasn't secure or safe to go to them to photograph them. And social media came to my aid, and it's completely transformed actually my outlook on social media, because I just used all of the channels I had available to me to call out to people to help with images. And I've just been totally amazed by the generosity of people who take fantastic photographs and have got a whole back catalogue of brilliant images of medieval and Tudor sites out there. And in particular, the community of Flickr online, who are just fabulous. These are people who take the most wonderful photographs and are immensely generous in the way that they then make available in high resolution to people. And people have been, well, offering me more images than I was allowed to put into the book. So it's been a long process, but the lockdown story of it, I thought it was going to be a challenge, but it's ended up being, in a funny sort of way, incredibly positive, because I've learned that social media, when you reach out to people, can actually be a very positive thing.
You never have to leave the house again.
Well, there's no substitute for actually being able to touch the artifact or the document for real. So when they reopened the National Archives at Kew, I have to say I was hovering over my keyboard, because it was a bit like getting tickets for Glastonbury first off, because only a limited number of seats were available. But I was right in there, because after all that time, all of those months, to be able to get back and actually hold a letter signed by Henry VIII, or a letter to Thomas Cromwell on Tudor paper with all of the stains and signs of age on it, there's nothing like it.
Yeah, that's incredible. You've put years of work into this book. Are you proud of your achievement?
Yes, I'm always a bit self-conscious. Like I think any author, you want people to find it useful. You want to know that people are picking it up and looking at it. I think, like any historian, no sooner have you completed a piece of work than you can think of other ways of approaching it. And evidence turns up all the time. So I'm immediately conscious of the wonderful pieces of evidence that didn't make the cut. But that just gives me material for the future. But yes, and I've been very gratified with. I've had in a few weeks lots of contact from people who've found things in it and wanted to talk about it, and that's what you want. You did. Nobody, I don't think anyone doing any kind of writing writes only for themselves.
Sure.
Writing is a conversation, or the start of a conversation, and I'm really looking forward to that.
Do you, on a personal level, do you have ambitions of, do you like the idea of contributing to the historical record in the hope that people will use your book for reference hundreds of years from now?
Not ambition at that level. No, I'd like to feel that what I've done is enough to add to the collective body of writing, of study, of research on this subject and on other subjects. I don't expect my contribution to be valued any greater than anyone else's, but it would be nice if it's recognized to be a milestone on the ongoing in the ongoing conversation, and that will be good. But no, I don't expect much more than that. I wouldn't judge really any work of history to somehow be the last word on a subject. Sure. So I wouldn't expect that of my own work at all. If anything, I just hope it might be in a sense sort of the first word of a new round of discussion. And if that does follow, then that would be a really good outcome. And I would like us to move away from some of these frankly rather tired and old cliches. You know, let's tell a different story about Henry VIII and the Tudors. I think also we've got a bit of an amnesia about this episode. We are a very secular society, but really there is no village, town, or city in England and Wales that isn't in some way still today marked by the dissolution story. And so we need to make it part of our consciousness.
When you're writing, when you're deep in the work of writing a book such as this, funny old question, but I am curious, how many hours a day do you write for? How long can you write before it starts feeling unproductive and your brain starts getting a bit frazzled? What's your preferred time spent writing?
For me, it's very variable. I tend to write to a word limit. So I will set myself, when I'm trying to finish a piece of work like this, I will set myself a daily word limit and make myself meet it. And it's a good day if I've met it. And then I will stop. I found that with the previous books I've written that it works well. I try to sort of set myself a lower limit and an upper limit. So usually I will write to a lower limit of a minimum of 1,000 words. But that's 1,000 words. Probably doesn't sound very much, but 1,000 words that I won't change. So 1,000 words of polished writing that I mustn't come back to the laptop the next day and just delete. And an upper limit, really, the most that I can usually do before my energy fades and my attention wanders is probably about 2,000. So that way I'd hope to write about 15,000 words a week, something like that, of relatively good stuff that I could keep, and I try and do it then in a way that is systematic. So that will not be just Monday to Friday, but that's Monday to Sunday. Because when you are writing, I think you can't do a period of work and then take a week off. the more continuous it is, the better it is, I find.
So, two quite light-hearted questions just to bring the conversation to an end. The first of them is, what's your favorite fact or story or piece of trivia about medieval times that not many people know about? A personal quirky favorite of yours that stands out, maybe something that you might share at a dinner party, or something to draw someone into a conversation.
Oh, goodness.
I mean, the gory stuff is always fun. That's why I was talking to you about the gory stuff earlier, but I wonder if there's anything else that springs to mind.
I think yes, I'm always entertained by the stories that unsettle the sort of received image of widely celebrated figures in the medieval past. So and often those have some sort of either in some way sort of colourful or even gruesome connection. So I always am entertained. It makes me smile to think about there's one of the sort of great figures of medieval philosophy is somebody called Thomas Aquinas, widely venerated today still as the sort of foremost Catholic theologian. And he's what people don't often hear about him is he's hugely fat.
Oh, really?
And regarded as sort of the greatest mind, one of the greatest minds of the Middle Ages. But he comes to a very sort of sticky end in that he, as far as we can tell, he dies from falling off his ass, largely because he's so fat he can scarcely get on this ass, and is regarded as a fine philosopher, but as a human being, somewhat comic, and he dies very suddenly simply because you can imagine this incredibly fat man struggling to get on top of a tiny little ass, and he falls off it and dies, and then is venerated as a saint. So that kind of entertains me.
Yeah, that's right.
I've always been drawn to the legend of King Henry V, celebrated by Shakespeare, Victor of Agincourt, all of that. I'm fascinated by the story that isn't told, which is that Henry V has a really fascinating, quite seriously fascinating, intimate friendship with a young man throughout his life, a man called Richard Courtenay, who's part of the family of the Earls of Devon. And they actually grow up together as boys. And as they move from adolescence into sort of early adulthood, they are hardly separated from each other. And when Henry V is dying in his campaign tent, as at the end, obviously, very end of his life, in 1422, in August 1422, he's dying of dysentery, which was always the medieval soldier's disease. But there's an account which is just never described of that moment of his death, where he calls for this man who was his intimate friend, and how they embrace, and how this man who had this intense friendship with actually washes his feet and kisses his feet as he's lying on his deathbed. And it just opens up a totally different Henry V to the Shakespearean sort of warlord figure, and actually a sort of a Henry V at times, I suppose, a Henry V of a completely different character, and with a dimension to his personality that I think we'd all like to know a bit more about. And it's a tantalizing glimpse. So it's another story of a death, but again, I suppose I'm drawn to the flip side of these figures. Thomas Aquinas, brilliant philosopher, spectacularly fat man who can't climb on a donkey and dies. And Henry V, English warlord trouncing the French, but who has a fascinating, intense, lifelong male-to-male friendship that I'm sure we'd like to investigate further.
Sure. Okay, one last question before we go. Let me just see how long I've got on that. Okay, 6.5 minutes. Brilliant. One last question. If you could meet one person from history, who would it be?
Oh, goodness.
That's a very difficult question for you, isn't it?
Yeah, I think right now it would probably have to be because of spending time with these characters working on the book. It would actually be Thomas Wolsey, Cardinal.
Oh wow, that's interesting.
Henry VIII's first chief minister, and I find him far more fascinating, I would say, than Thomas Cromwell. He's a man like Cromwell who comes from a very obscure origin, and so in some ways a man who's propelled to great heights by his own ability. But as I argue in the book, I think in many ways what Henry and Cromwell are beginning to do, the start of the dissolution of the monasteries, is actually implement a grand plan that was Wolsey's. And I think he, in recent years, because he's not as interesting to the familiar story of Henry and his wives as others, he's got rather edged to the sidelines. I'd like to bring him back into focus. He's not the grotesque figure played by Orson Welles in the movie of Man for All Seasons. And again, here is a complex character that the layers of which I'd like to be able to peel off, and the best way to do that would be to see him.
Yeah, go for a pint.
Yeah.
Great response. Okay, well, we've been speaking for longer than I thought we were going to speak, and I've actually thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much for joining me today. It's been great.
No problem at all. I hope it's useful to you.
Yeah. Is there anything that you would like, any links that you would like to share, like social media channels, website, anything that you would like to share at the end of this conversation? And I can also put it in the description beneath as well.
Yeah, well, it would be, I'd be glad if you linked it to my Twitter. So sure. That's at James G. Clark, which is the same as the byline on the book. And you could connect it to I can send it to you. They're putting review comments and so on there is a dedicated page for the book on the Yale website. So if I send you that as well, that would be really useful.
Absolutely. Okay, we'll make sure that all of that happens. Thanks a lot for joining me again today. If anyone wants to pick up the book, The Dissolution of the Monasteries by James Clark is available now. I purchased my copy from Amazon. I imagine it's on sale in other places as well. James, thank you very much for joining me today. And all the best to you.
Lovely. Good to meet you.
All the very best. Thank you. Bye.